Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, Homecoming Shadows. The desert dust had barely settled from Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson's boots when the process server appeared at his door. 4 tours in Afghanistan, 3 Purple Hearts, and 2 Bronze Stars. None of it prepared him for the papers thrust into his calloused hands. Child support. $10,000 monthly. For twins he'd never seen. Joseph stood in the doorway of his sparse apartment, reading the documents with the same methodical precision he'd once used to disarm IDs. His wife Shelby had filed while he was overseas, claiming their marriage had produced twin boys, now 3 years old. The math was simple. He'd been deployed when these children were supposedly conceived. His phone buzzed. A text from his old unit commander, Colonel Gerald Garrison. "Welcome home, soldier. Heard about the legal troubles. Coffee tomorrow." Joseph's jaw tightened. News traveled fast in military circles. He'd built his reputation on being unbreakable, unmovable, and utterly loyal. But loyalty, he was learning, was a one-way street. The apartment felt alien after 18 months in the mountains of Kandahar. Shelby had redecorated, expensive furniture, high-end electronics, designer clothes scattered across surfaces. On his sergeant's salary, none of this should have been affordable. His wedding photo sat face down on the nightstand, replaced by glamorous selfies of Shelby in places he'd never been. Joseph methodically searched the apartment, his training kicking in. In the bedroom closet, behind designer dresses, he found a shoebox. Inside, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, jewelry he'd never bought her. All dated during his deployments. All signed with 2 names, Shelby Nelson and Alan Reeves. Alan Reeves. Joseph knew that name. City Planning Commissioner, recently appointed to oversee military base housing contracts. A man who'd made his fortune while Joseph bled for his country. The front door opened. Shelby walked in, no longer the sweet small-town girl he'd married 5 years ago. Designer heels clicked against hardwood floors, her blonde hair professionally styled, lips painted crimson. She stopped short seeing him, her blue eyes flashing with something between guilt and defiance. "Joseph." Her voice was different, colder, calculated. "I didn't expect you back so soon." Evidently, he held up the legal papers. "Care to explain?" Shelby lifted her chin, the innocent act dissolving. "You were never here. I had needs. Alan provided what you couldn't: stability, presence, a future, and children. Those boys deserve better than a father who chooses war over family." She moved to the bar cart, pouring herself wine with steady hands. "Alan's been more of a father to them than you ever could be." Joseph studied her like he would an enemy combatant. "Where are they?" "Safe. With their real father." The words hit like shrapnel designed to wound. "Alan's lawyers say you'll pay or face garnishment. Military pension, disability, everything." "I see." Joseph's voice remained level, but his eyes had gone cold. The same look that had preceded every successful mission. "And if I refuse?" Shelby smiled, confident in her victory. "Then you'll learn what happens to deadbeat dads. Alan has connections. Joseph. Judges, politicians, people who matter. You're just a broken soldier with PTSD. Who do you think they'll believe?" She was right about one thing. Joseph was broken, but not in the way she imagined. 4 tours had stripped away everything soft, everything forgiving. What remained was pure predator, honed by years of hunting men through mountain caves and urban hellscapes. "I'll need to see them," he said finally. "The boys." "Absolutely not." Shelby's mask slipped. "Alan won't allow it. Alan doesn't get a vote. I'm still legally their father until proven otherwise." Panic flashed across her features. "Joseph, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Take the deal. Pay the support. We can all move on." But Joseph was already moving, his mind shifting into tactical mode. Court date. Next Friday, 10 a.m. Judge Morrison presiding. She seemed relieved by his apparent acceptance. "Just don't fight this, Joseph. You can't win." After she left, to Alan's house, he assumed, Joseph sat in the gathering darkness. Around him, the apartment felt like a forward operating base in enemy territory. which he realized it was. His phone rang. Gerald Garrison. How bad is it, son? They think they're fighting a desperate veteran, Joseph said. They're wrong. What do you need? Everything you can find on Alan Reeves. And Gerald? This stays between us. A pause. Roger that. Joseph? Whatever you're planning is necessary. Joseph ended the call and stared at the photo of Shelby and Alan on the nightstand. In it, they stood before a luxury hotel, her hand resting on the man's chest, both laughing at some private joke. Joseph had killed men for less than what they'd done to him. But death was quick, merciful. What he had planned would last much longer. Chapter 2. Intelligence Gathering. Colonel Gerald Garrison arrived at the coffee shop with a thick manila folder and the grim expression of a man delivering bad news. Joseph sat in the corner booth, positioned to watch all entrances, old habits that had kept him alive in Hellman Province. Alan Reeves, Gerald said, sliding the folder across the table. 42, divorced twice, no kids of his own until now. Built his fortune on military construction contracts, base housing specifically. Joseph flipped through surveillance photos, financial records, property deeds. Gerald's intelligence network was thorough. He's been busy while I was away. It's worse. Those housing contracts? They're cutting corners. Substandard materials, safety violations covered up. Military families living in conditions that would make a Taliban cave look luxurious. Gerald's jaw worked with suppressed anger. But here's the interesting part. Someone's been feeding him inside information. Someone with access to base engineering reports, inspection schedules, competitive bid information. Someone in uniform. Has to be. The question is who? Gerald studied Joseph's face. What are you thinking? Joseph was thinking about improvised explosive devices. How the smallest component, placed correctly, could bring down an entire building. I need to see these twins. Joseph. They're using children as weapons, Gerald. That crosses a line. Joseph's voice carried the same quiet menace that had once made Taliban fighters surrender rather than face him in close quarters. I need you to arrange a meeting. With Shelby. With Alan Reeves. Gerald looked skeptical. Why would he agree to that? Because I'm going to offer him what every greedy man wants. More money than he can imagine. That afternoon, Joseph drove to the offices of Reeves Development Corporation. The building was new, gleaming glass and steel that screamed of military contract money. The lobby displayed photos of Alan shaking hands with politicians, cutting ribbons at base housing projects, smiling beside uniformed officers. Alan Reeves was everything Joseph expected, soft, manicured, the kind of man who'd never missed a meal or slept in the mud. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of barely concealed smugness as he gestured Joseph into his corner office. Sergeant Nelson, I've heard so much about you. Alan's handshake was weak, his palm damp. Please sit. The office walls were covered with awards, photos, and architectural plans. Joseph's trained eye caught details others might miss. Multiple phones, a safe behind a painting, security cameras positioned to monitor approaches to the building. This man lived in fear despite his confident facade. Understand you've been caring for my wife, Joseph said, settling into the leather chair like a coiled spring. Alan's smile faltered slightly. Shelby is a remarkable woman. She deserves better than being abandoned for years at a time. She deserves security. I respect that. Joseph pulled out a cashier's check, placing it on the desk. 100,000. A gesture of goodwill. Alan's eyes fixed on the check. For what? The boys. I want to establish a relationship with them. Gradually, of course. Under supervised conditions. Joseph leaned forward slightly. I'm not here to fight you, Mr. Reeves. I'm here to make a deal. What kind of deal? I have skills your business could use. Security, consulting, overseas construction projects, navigating military bureaucracy. Joseph gestured at the awards on the wall. You've built an empire on military contracts. I can help you expand it. Alan's greed was almost palpable. What exactly are you proposing? Partnership. I bring you access to classified construction projects, advanced knowledge of contract opportunities, inside information on competing bids. Joseph watched Alan's pupils dilate with avarice. In exchange, I want access to my sons and a reduction in child support obligations. Illegal access to classified information? Alan tried to look shocked, but his voice carried eager undertones. Gray areas. The kind of intelligence gathering that's technically legal but ethically questionable. Joseph shrugged. I spent 4 tours learning how the system really works. That knowledge is valuable. Alan was quiet for several minutes, his businessman's mind calculating possibilities. I need proof of concept, something that demonstrates your capabilities. Joseph had expected this. He pulled out a second folder. Next month's housing contract bids for Fort Braxton. Your competitors' proposals, budget breakdowns, personnel assignments. He opened the folder slightly, letting Alan glimpse the classified stamps. Consider it a down payment. Alan's breathing quickened. How did you? I have friends who trust me. The question is whether you're smart enough to profit from that trust. Joseph closed the folder and stood. I'll need an answer by tomorrow, and I'll need to meet my sons this weekend. As Joseph walked toward the door, Alan called out, the child support will be renegotiated once our partnership proves profitable. Joseph paused at the door. One more thing, Mr. Reeves. I don't forgive betrayal, business or personal. Keep that in mind. Outside the building, Joseph sat in his truck and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Gerald Garrison. It started. The second was to Lieutenant Craig Goldstein, a JAG lawyer who owed Joseph his life from Kandahar. Craig, I need you to file papers on my behalf. Today. What kind of papers? Paternity test for the twins, emergency custody hearing, and fraud charges against Shelby. Joseph watched Alan's office window, seeing the man pacing frantically. Also, I need you to research something for me. What happens to child support obligations when the requesting party is found guilty of identity theft? Joseph, what have you gotten yourself into? Justice, Craig. Old Testament style. That evening, Shelby called, her voice shrill with panic. What did you do? Alan is furious. He says you threatened him. I offered him a business opportunity. He seemed interested. Joseph stood on his apartment balcony, watching the sun set over the city where he'd been born and raised, where he'd married the woman who now saw him as nothing more than a paycheck. Did you tell him about our conversation? Of course I did. We don't keep secrets. Good. Honesty is important in a relationship. Joseph smiled grimly. By the way, I've filed for a paternity test. Court ordered. You'll receive the papers tomorrow. The line went silent. Then, Joseph, please, don't destroy what we've built. Shelby, he said softly, what you built was a lie. I'm just revealing the foundation. After hanging up, Joseph opened his laptop and began typing. The first document was a detailed letter to the FBI's fraud division, outlining suspicious activities in military contract awards. The second was a comprehensive dossier on Alan Reeves' business practices, compiled from Gerald intelligence and Joseph's own observations. But the third document was the most important, a step-by-step plan for the complete destruction of everyone who had betrayed him. He'd learned in Afghanistan that the best operations were the ones where the enemy destroyed themselves. Joseph was simply going to light the fuse. Chapter 3. First Contact. The court-mandated meeting took place at a family services center supervised by a social worker named Johanna Woods. Joseph arrived early, sitting in the sterile waiting room with the same patients he'd once used in Sniper Hides. When Shelby and Alan arrived with the twins, Joseph felt something twist in his chest. The boys were beautiful. Dark hair, serious brown eyes, quiet demeanor that reminded him of himself at that age. They clung to Alan, eyeing Joseph with the wariness of children who'd been told he was dangerous. Boys, this is Joseph, Shelby said, her voice artificially bright. He's a friend. The older twin, Marcus, according to the files, stepped forward with the solemnity of a miniature adult. Are you the soldier man? I am. Joseph knelt to the boy's level, his scarred hands gentle despite their capacity for violence. What else did they tell you about me? That you hurt people for money, the younger twin, Michael, whispered. Joseph's eyes flicked to Alan, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. I protect people. Actually, that's what soldiers do. For the next hour, Joseph played with children who bore no resemblance to him. answered their questions about war with age-appropriate honesty, and felt his rage crystallize into something harder and colder than diamond. These boys weren't pawns in his war with Shelby. They were innocent casualties of her deception. When the session ended, Alan lingered as Shelby gathered the children. "About that business proposition," he said quietly. "Still interested?" "Very. But I need guarantees. Protection." Joseph smiled without warmth. "Mr. Reeves, I spent 4 tours keeping people alive in the world's most dangerous places. I know all about protection." That evening, Joseph received a text message from an unknown number. "The boys love you already. Don't ruin this." It was Shelby, he realized, using a new phone. He responded, "DNA results tomorrow. Then we'll see who's ruining what." The next morning brought 2 pieces of news. First, Craig Goldstein called with the paternity results. "You're not the father, Joseph. Not even close. Want me to file fraud charges?" "Not yet. Let me handle this my way first." The second call was from Gerald Garrison, founder leak. Major Sergio Strickland, Base Engineering Division. Been feeding information to Reeves for 2 years. But here's the twist. He's not doing it for money. Then why? Blackmail. Alan has photos of Strickland with a local prostitute. Turns out she's 17, though she looks older. Strickland didn't know, but try explaining that to a court-martial. Joseph felt the pieces clicking into place. Where's Strickland now? Fort Braxton. Engineering office. "Joseph, if you're planning what I think you're planning, I need 24 hours, Gerald. After that, you can arrest everyone involved." Joseph drove to Fort Braxton, using his military ID to access the base. He found Major Strickland hunched over engineering reports in an empty office building, looking like a man carrying the weight of the world. "Sergio," Joseph said, closing the office door behind him. Strickland spun around, his face going pale. "Sergeant Nelson, I heard you were back. I hear you've been busy while I was away, feeding classified information to civilian contractors." Joseph sat down across from Strickland's desk. "How long has Alan Reeves been blackmailing you?" The major's composure cracked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Joseph pulled out his phone, showing Strickland a photo Gerald had provided. The major entering a motel with a young woman. 17, Sergio. Though I'm betting you didn't know that when Alan's photographer captured this moment. Strickland buried his face in his hands. "Jesus Christ. How did you? I make it my business to know who's betraying their oath." Joseph leaned back in his chair. "The question is what you're going to do about it. I can't stop. Alan has other photos, videos. My career, my family. Would all be destroyed if this came out." Joseph finished. "But what if I told you there was a way to end this? To destroy Alan Reeves completely while protecting yourself?" Strickland looked up, hope and desperation warring in his eyes. "Ow." Joseph smiled, and for the first time in days it was genuine, by giving him exactly what he wants. Over the next hour, Joseph outlined his plan. Strickland would continue feeding information to Alan, but now the intelligence would be carefully crafted by Joseph and Gerald. Fake contract opportunities, false inspection schedules, fabricated competitive bids, all designed to lead Alan deeper into a trap of his own greed. "He'll bid on projects that don't exist," Joseph explained. "Invest in materials for contracts he'll never win. By the time he realizes what's happening, he'll have committed federal fraud on a massive scale. And the blackmail? Handled. Alan Reeves will have bigger problems than compromising photos." Joseph stood to leave. "One more thing, Sergio. After this is over, you're going to resign your commission and disappear. Quietly. Because if I ever see you again, blackmail will be the least of your worries." That night, Joseph called Alan Reeves. "I have something you'll want to see. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Warehouse District, 1247, Industrial Boulevard." "What kind of something?" "The kind that will make you the largest military contractor on the East Coast." Joseph hung up before Alan could respond. Then he called Shelby. DNA results came back. A long pause. "And we need to talk. All 3 of us. Tomorrow night." Joseph gave her the same address. "Bring the boys. They should hear the truth from their real father." "Joseph, please." 8:30, Shelby. "Don't be late." Joseph spent the rest of the evening preparing the warehouse, cameras, recording equipment, and other tools of the trade he'd learned in special operations. By tomorrow night, everything would be in place. The trap would be set, and his enemies would walk willingly into their own destruction. He thought about the twins, Marcus and Michael, and felt a pang of genuine sorrow. They deserved better than the parents they'd been given. But Joseph had learned long ago that innocence was often the first casualty of war. Tomorrow night, Shelby and Alan would learn what happened when you declared war on someone who fought for a living. The revenge was going to be methodical, brutal, and absolutely final. Joseph Nelson didn't believe in second chances. Chapter 4. The Setup. The warehouse in the industrial district had been abandoned for 2 years, its windows dark and loading docks empty. Joseph arrived 3 hours early, transforming the cavernous space into a theater of his own design. Hidden cameras captured every angle, recording equipment hummed quietly in the shadows, and carefully placed lighting would ensure perfect visibility for what was to come. At 7 p.m., Major Strickland arrived as instructed, carrying a briefcase full of fabricated documents. "Are you sure about this, Sergeant?" "In my experience, people destroy themselves," Joseph replied, adjusting a camera angle. "We're just providing the opportunity." Alan Reeves arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, his expensive sedan gleaming under the warehouse's security lights. He entered cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with the surroundings, but driven by greed stronger than his fear. "This is dramatic, even for you," Alan said, his voice echoing in the empty space. Joseph stepped from the shadows, Strickland beside him. "Mr. Reeves, I believe you know Major Strickland." Alan's eyes widened, then narrowed. "What is this?" "Business," Joseph said simply. "The Major has information you'll find extremely valuable." "Sergio." Strickland opened his briefcase with shaking hands. "Fort Braxton is expanding. New housing contracts worth $200 million. The bidding process is rigged. I can guarantee your company wins every contract." Alan's businessman instincts warred with his survival instincts. "And in exchange, 20% of all contract values paid to offshore accounts will provide," Joseph said, "plus guaranteed protection from any military investigations." "This is conspiracy to commit federal fraud," Alan said, but his voice carried excitement rather than concern. "This is opportunity," Joseph corrected, "the kind that comes once in a lifetime." Alan studied the documents Strickland provided, falsified bid specifications, fabricated project timelines, fake budget allocations. To his greedy eyes, they represented a fortune beyond imagination. "I'll need guarantees," Alan said finally. "Protection if something goes wrong." Joseph smiled coldly. "You'll have the protection of everyone involved having too much to lose. Mutual assured destruction, civilian style." At 8:30, headlights swept across the warehouse walls. Shelby's SUV pulled up outside, the twins visible in their car seats. Joseph felt his jaw tighten. Bringing children to this confrontation violated every rule of engagement he'd ever known. Shelby entered alone, leaving the boys in the vehicle. She wore the same confident mask she'd worn in the apartment, but Joseph could see cracks forming around the edges. "Alan." She looked between the 3 men with growing unease. "What's going on?" "Business," Alan said, possessive hands settling on her shoulders. "Your husband is helping us secure our future." "Our future?" Joseph's voice carried Arctic cold. "Interesting choice of words." He pulled out the DNA test results, holding them where both Shelby and Alan could see. "These boys aren't mine, Shelby. We both know that. The question is whether Alan knows who their real father is." The color drained from Shelby's face. "Joseph, please." "Please what?" "Please continue paying child support for another man's children. Please ignore the fact that my wife has been committing fraud." Joseph stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Or please pretend I don't know about your other secret." Alan frowned. "What secret?" Joseph pulled out a second set of documents. Financial records Gerald had obtained through military intelligence channels. "Your girlfriend has been busy while you two have been playing house. Corporate accounts, property transfers, investment portfolios, all in her name alone." Alan grabbed the papers, his face darkening as he read. Shelby, what is this? I was protecting us, she said quickly. If something happened to you. Protecting yourself, Alan snarled. You've been stealing from me. Not stealing. Planning. Shelby's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating predator beneath. You think I'd tie my future to a man who bribes military officers? I know what you've been doing, Alan. The substandard housing, the safety violations, the bribes. Did you really think I was too stupid to figure it out? The warehouse fell silent except for the hum of recording equipment. Joseph watched with professional interest as his enemies turned on each other, exactly as he'd predicted. You bitch, Alan breathed. You've been playing me from the beginning. Just like you played that major, Shelby shot back, gesturing at Strickland. Did you think I didn't know about the blackmail? About the underage girl? Joseph felt satisfaction wash over him. Everything was proceeding perfectly. Gentlemen, lady, perhaps we should discuss the real reason we're here. He activated a wall-mounted monitor, displaying surveillance footage from outside Alan's office building. The timestamp showed earlier that day. FBI agents entering the lobby, federal prosecutors carrying boxes of evidence from Alan's office. While you two have been arguing, federal investigators have been very busy, Joseph said conversationally. Seems someone provided them with detailed evidence of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy involving military contracts. Alan went pale. You son of a bitch. You set us up. I gave you exactly what you wanted, more classified information than you could handle. Unfortunately for you, everything Major Strickland provided was fabricated. False documents, fake contracts, non-existent projects. Joseph's smile was razor-sharp. But your enthusiastic participation in the conspiracy was very real, very recorded, very illegal. Shelby backed toward the door. Alan, we need to leave. Now. Nobody's leaving, Joseph said quietly, and something in his voice stopped her cold. We haven't discussed the children yet. He gestured toward the SUV outside, where Marcus and Michael sat waiting. Those boys deserve better than being used as weapons in your schemes. They deserve a father who won't abandon them when federal investigators come calling. You're not their father, Shelby spat. No, but I know who is. Joseph pulled out a final document. Private investigator reports, DNA analysis, financial records. Ricardo Santos, construction foreman for Reeves Development. Married man, 3 other children, currently in federal custody for immigration violations. Alan's face went ashen. Santos? But he's the father of your girlfriend's twins. The man whose false immigration papers you provided in exchange for cheap labor. The man who's now cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for deportation instead of prison. Joseph's voice carried grim satisfaction. Funny how quickly loyalty disappears when federal prosecutors start offering deals. The warehouse erupted in shouting. Alan screaming betrayal at Shelby. Shelby denying everything. Strickland pleading for protection that wouldn't come. Joseph watched the chaos with the detached interest of a predator observing wounded prey. Enough! His command voice, honed by years of leading men in combat, cut through the noise like a blade. You want to know what happens next? I'll tell you. Joseph activated the surveillance equipment, showing them feeds from outside. Federal agents surrounded the building, their vehicles blocking every exit. Alan, you're going to federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. Military contractors who steal from soldiers get special treatment in federal facilities. You'll love it. Shelby, you're facing fraud charges for the fake child support, identity theft for stealing my financial information, and accessory charges for Alan's crimes. The boys will go into foster care while the courts sort out their real parentage. Major Strickland, you're being court-martialed for treason, reduced in rank, and dishonorably discharged. Your pension is forfeit, your benefits revoked. Joseph paused, letting the weight of their destruction settle over them. But here's the beautiful part. I'm walking away clean. Everything I did was legal, if ethically questionable. Everything you did was federal felony. Shelby's composure finally shattered completely. Joseph, please. The boys need stability. Don't let them suffer for our mistakes. Our mistakes. Joseph's laugh was devoid of humor. You chose greed over loyalty, betrayal over honor. You used innocent children as weapons against a man who never did anything but love you and serve his country. He moved toward the door, pausing beside Shelby. You wanted to know what happened to the man you married? He died somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, killed by the knowledge that the woman he loved was betraying him while he bled for strangers. What replaced him doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, doesn't take prisoners. As Joseph stepped outside, federal agents moved in. Through the warehouse windows, he could see Alan and Shelby being placed in handcuffs, their shouts of protest echoing across the empty industrial district. Gerald Garrison appeared beside Joseph's truck. Clean work. It's not finished yet, Joseph said, watching as Marcus and Michael were led away by social services. Those boys need a real father, not a deportee or a convict. What are you thinking? Joseph started his truck, his face hard with resolve. I'm thinking it's time for Ricardo Santos to have a very important conversation with federal prosecutors about cooperation, deportation, and permanent severance of parental rights. As he drove away from the warehouse, Joseph felt no satisfaction, no sense of completion. Revenge was a meal best served cold, but it always left him hungry for something else, something he'd lost in the mountains of Afghanistan and would never get back. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, he had enemies to destroy and innocents to protect. In Joseph Nelson's world, there was rarely a difference between the two. Chapter 5. Federal Complications. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity as Joseph sat in the witness waiting room, reviewing his testimony one final time. 3 weeks had passed since the warehouse confrontation, and the wheels of justice were grinding forward with mechanical precision. Alan Reeves sat in federal detention, unable to make bail on charges that included conspiracy, bribery, and fraud. Shelby had been released pending trial, but faced financial ruin as her assets were frozen by federal seizure orders. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider entered the waiting room, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes carrying the satisfaction of a prosecutor with an airtight case. Sergeant Nelson, thank you for your cooperation in this matter. Just doing my civic duty, Joseph replied, though both of them knew his motivations ran deeper than patriotism. The defense attorneys will try to paint you as a vengeful ex-husband seeking retribution, Schneider warned. They'll claim you orchestrated this entire operation purely for personal revenge. Joseph's smile was thin. Will they? That seems like a dangerous strategy, considering I'm the primary witness against their clients. Through the courthouse windows, Joseph could see protesters gathering, military families demanding justice for substandard base housing, veterans groups calling for harsher penalties for contract fraud. The case had become a symbol of everything wrong with military privatization, and public opinion strongly favored the prosecution. Craig Goldstein appeared in the doorway, carrying a thick file folder. Joseph, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Ricardo Santos. He's refusing to cooperate with child services regarding parental rights termination. Claims he wants custody of the twins when he's deported to Mexico. Joseph felt cold fury rising in his chest. Explain. Santos thinks he can use the boys as leverage for a better deal with immigration authorities. Stay in the U.S., reduce charges, possible path to citizenship. Craig sat down heavily. Immigration law is complex, but blood relation carries significant weight in custody hearings. Even when the father is a convicted felon facing deportation, even then, the courts prioritize biological parents over all other considerations unless abuse or neglect can be proven. Craig opened his file. Santos has been advised by his attorney that parental rights could be his ticket to remaining in the country. Joseph stood and walked to the window, watching the protesters below. Among them, he noticed several familiar faces, soldiers from his old unit, veterans he'd served with in Afghanistan. They were here to support him, to see justice done. But justice, he was learning, was a complicated concept when children were involved. What about the foster family? Joseph asked. Lou and Carlos Jarvis. Good people, but temporary placement only. They can't adopt while Santos maintains parental rights. Craig hesitated. Joseph, there's something else. Social services is recommending the boys be placed with Santos's extended family in Mexico if he's deported. Absolutely not. Joseph's voice carried the same finality he'd once used to end Taliban negotiations. Those children are American citizens. They stay in America. Then we need Santos to voluntarily terminate his rights. And he's not going to do that unless he gets something in return. Joseph turned from the window, his mind already shifting into tactical mode. Set up a meeting. Santos, his attorney, immigration officials. Today. Joseph, what are you planning? Justice. The kind that actually protects innocents instead of rewarding parasites. 2 hours later, Joseph sat across a steel table from Ricardo Santos in the Federal Detention Center's interview room. Santos was smaller than expected, nervous eyes darting between Joseph, his public defender Paulette Perry, and immigration attorney Gerald Garrison. Joseph had called in every favor to get Gerald appointed to handle Santos's case. Mr. Santos, Joseph began in fluent Spanish. We need to discuss your children. Santos straightened, his machismo asserting itself despite his orange jumpsuit. They're my sons. My blood. Your blood that you abandoned when you chose to work illegally and commit identity fraud. Joseph replied, still in Spanish. Your blood that you never supported, never claimed, never protected. Santos's attorney leaned forward. My client is willing to discuss cooperation in exchange for considerations regarding his immigration status. Joseph switched back to English. Mr. Santos, I'm going to make you an offer. One time only. He pulled out a document packet, meticulously prepared, legally reviewed, tactically devastating. Full voluntary termination of parental rights. Your sons remain in American foster care with possibility of adoption by qualified families. In exchange, Immigration and Customs Enforcement reduces your charges to misdemeanor immigration violations. Time served, voluntary deportation with possibility of legal reentry in 5 years. Santos frowned, clearly struggling with the English. His attorney translated rapidly, her expression growing darker as she read the fine print. This is extortion, Perry said. You're threatening my client with maximum penalties unless he abandons his children. I'm offering your client a choice, Joseph corrected. Accept responsibility for his crimes and make decisions in his children's best interests, or face the full consequences of federal prosecution while his sons grow up in institutional care. Gerald Garrison slid another document across the table. Alternative scenario. Mr. Santos fights deportation and parental rights termination. He loses both, spends 3 years in federal prison, gets deported anyway, and his children remain in permanent foster care because the legal battle prevents adoption proceedings. Santos looked between the documents, the weight of impossible choices evident on his face. What guarantee do I have? You have my word, Joseph said simply, and my word has kept men alive in places where angels fear to tread. Santos's attorney whispered urgently in his ear, but Santos waved her off. In Spanish, he asked Joseph, why do you care what happens to children that aren't yours? Joseph leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of 4 tours and a lifetime of making hard decisions. Because a real man protects innocence even when it costs him everything. Because those boys deserve better than being pawns in adult games. Because someone needs to put their interests first. The room fell silent. Through the reinforced glass windows, Joseph could see federal agents moving through the detention center corridors, processing the endless stream of people who'd gambled with American law and lost. Santos spoke slowly in English. If I sign, my boys stay in America? Get good families. The best families we can find. Educated, stable, loving parents who will raise them as American citizens with American opportunities. Joseph paused. But it has to be your choice, Santos. Not coerced, not forced. Your decision as their father. Santos stared at the termination papers for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were wet but resolved. My sons, they deserve better than a father in prison, a father who cannot protect them. He signed the documents with a shaking hand, each signature sealing his fate and freeing his children. When he finished, Santos looked directly at Joseph. You will watch over them? Make sure they are safe. You have my word. As they prepared to leave, Santos's attorney made one final attempt. Ricardo, giving up everything. Your children, your chance at citizenship, your future in America. Santos stood slowly, dignity intact despite his circumstances. No, I am giving my children their future in America. That is what a father does. Outside the detention center, Gerald Garrison shook his head in amazement. In 20 years of immigration law, I've never seen anything like that. You didn't threaten him, didn't coerce him. You just convinced him to do the right thing. Sometimes the best weapon is the truth, Joseph replied. Santos is a decent man who made bad choices. When given the opportunity to choose his children's welfare over his own interests, he chose correctly. Craig Goldstein was waiting by Joseph's truck with more paperwork. Foster family approval, adoption pre-qualification, family court scheduling. This is moving fast. How fast? If everything goes smoothly, Marcus and Michael could be placed with permanent families within 6 months. Craig studied Joseph's face. What about you? Have you considered applying for custody yourself? Joseph looked back at the detention center, thinking about Santos signing away his parental rights to give his children a better life. I'm not father material, Craig. I'm a soldier. I protect people, I don't raise them. Maybe it's time to learn the difference. As Joseph drove away from the courthouse, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The boys ask about you every day. Foster family says you can visit anytime. Jay Woods, Social Services. Joseph stared at the message for a long moment. Marcus and Michael, innocent casualties of adult warfare, now caught between their biological father's sacrifice and their mother's betrayal. They deserved stability, safety, and love. Whether Joseph was capable of providing any of those things remained to be seen. Tomorrow, Shelby and Alan would face their first court appearances. Tomorrow, the media circus would intensify. Tomorrow, justice would continue its slow, grinding advance. But today, 2 little boys were safe, their future secured by their father's sacrifice and their former stepfather's protection. In Joseph's experience, small victories were often the most important ones. The war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. Chapter 6, Courtroom Warfare. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed beyond capacity, spectators spilling into the hallway as the military contracting fraud trial of the decade got underway. Media crews lined the walls, their cameras focused on the defendant's table, where Alan Reeves sat beside his high-powered defense attorney, Cora McGrath, a woman whose reputation for winning impossible cases was exceeded only by her fees. Joseph sat in the witness gallery, his dress blues pristine, his bearing ramrod straight. Around him, other veterans filled the courtroom. Men and women who'd lived in the substandard housing Alan's company had built, who trusted their lives to construction that prioritized profit over safety. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider rose for opening statements, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about betrayal of the highest order. The defendant, Alan Reeves, systematically defrauded the United States military, endangering the lives of service members and their families for personal profit. She gestured toward a display showing photographs of mold-infested military housing, collapsed roofing, and electrical fires. While our soldiers fought overseas, the defendant was waging war on their families at home, providing substandard housing that put children at risk and families in danger. McGrath's response was predictably aggressive. Members of the jury, my client is the victim of an elaborate revenge plot orchestrated by psychologically damaged veteran seeking retribution against his ex-wife. Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson used his military training and connections to frame an innocent businessman, manufacturing evidence and manipulating witnesses to serve his personal vendetta. Joseph felt eyes turning toward him throughout the courtroom. McGrath was playing the only card available to her. Make Joseph the villain and Alan the victim. It was a dangerous strategy, but one that might create reasonable doubt. The first day of testimony focused on the technical aspects of Alan's construction contracts. Structural engineers testified about safety violations. Military housing inspectors detailed cover-ups and falsified reports. The evidence was damning, But Joseph knew the real battle would come when character witnesses took the stand. During the lunch recess, Craig Goldstein pulled Joseph aside. McGrath's bringing in a psychological expert to testify about PTSD and its effects on judgment and behavior. She's going to argue that your entire operation was the product of a damaged psyche seeking revenge. Let her try, Joseph said calmly. My psychological evaluations are part of the military record. 4 tours, 3 Purple Hearts, no psychological disability rating. That's not the point. She doesn't need to prove you're clinically damaged, just that your judgment was compromised by personal motivation. Craig lowered his voice. There's something else. Shelby's agreed to testify for the defense. Joseph felt his blood pressure spike. In exchange for what? Reduced charges on her fraud case. Community service instead of prison time. Craig looked uncomfortable. Joseph, she's going to testify that you threatened her, that you coerced her into the warehouse meeting, that everything was orchestrated to destroy her relationship with Alan. And people will believe her. Grieving wife, mother separated from her children, facing financial ruin? Juries are sympathetic to that narrative. Craig hesitated. Unless we can find a way to discredit her testimony. Joseph smiled grimly. Don't worry about Shelby. I know exactly how to handle her. That afternoon, the prosecution called Major Sergio Strickland to testify. The disgraced officer looked broken as he took the oath, his uniform replaced with civilian clothes. His military bearing collapsed under the weight of his shame. Major Strickland, Schneider began, please tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Strickland's voice was barely audible. Alan Reeves blackmailed me into providing classified military information. He used photographs of me with a minor to force my cooperation. McGrath objected immediately. Hearsay, Your Honor. The witness is testifying about alleged blackmail that has never been proven. I'll allow it, Judge Morrison ruled. The witness may continue. For the next hour, Strickland detailed 2 years of systematic blackmail, forced cooperation, and military information trafficking. His testimony was devastating, but Joseph could see McGrath preparing her counterattack. Major Strickland, McGrath began her cross-examination. Isn't it true that you're facing court-martial for treason and are testifying here in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence? Yes, ma'am. And isn't it true that your initial contact with my client was facilitated by Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson, who provided you with fabricated information to pass along? Strickland hesitated. Sergeant Nelson told me to continue providing information, but by then... So, Sergeant Nelson was directing your actions? Telling you what information to provide to my client? In the final stages, yes, but... Thank you, Major. No further questions. Joseph watched the jury's faces, seeing doubt creeping in. McGrath was skillfully painting him as the puppet master, manipulating everyone around him for personal revenge. The strategy was working. On the second day, Shelby took the stand. She'd lost weight during the weeks since the warehouse confrontation, her designer clothes replaced with conservative attire designed to evoke sympathy. Her performance was masterful. The grieving wife, the protective mother, the woman driven to desperate measures by her husband's abandonment. I never intended to hurt anyone, she testified, tears streaming down her face. I was alone, raising children without support, trying to survive while my husband chose war over family. McGrath guided her through testimony designed to portray Joseph as controlling, manipulative, and vengeful. Did your husband threaten you regarding your relationship with Mr. Reeves? Constantly. He said he would destroy anyone who betrayed him. He said he didn't forgive and didn't forget. Shelby looked directly at Joseph. I was terrified of what he might do. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal but careful. Schneider systematically dismantled Shelby's victim narrative, highlighting her financial deception, her fraud schemes, her manipulation of innocent children. Mrs. Nelson, you filed for child support claiming the defendant was the father of your twins, correct? Yes. Despite knowing that your husband was not the biological father. I thought he might be. The timing was unclear. But DNA testing proved definitively that he was not the father, correct? Yes. And you never corrected this filing with the court, even after learning the truth. Shelby's composure began to crack. I was confused, frightened. You were committing fraud to extract money from a man serving his country overseas, weren't you? Objection, McGrath shouted. Sustained, Judge Morrison ruled, but the damage was done. The jury had seen, through Shelby's performance, to the calculating predator beneath. When court recessed for the day, Joseph found himself surrounded by reporters and veterans advocates. The story had captured national attention. The wounded warrior seeking justice against the corrupt contractor and faithless wife. Public opinion was solidly on his side, but jury verdicts weren't determined by public opinion. That evening, Gerald Garrison called with an update on the twins. Marcus and Michael are doing well in foster care. The Jarvis family is interested in permanent adoption if parental rights can be fully terminated. What about Santos? Deported yesterday. Voluntary departure, no contest. His termination of parental rights was processed this morning. Gerald paused. Joseph, social services want to discuss something with you. About the adoption process. What about it? The boys have been asking for you. They want to know when you're coming to see them again. Gerald's voice carried unusual emotion. They've been telling their foster parents that you're their real dad, the one who protects people. Joseph felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he'd thought war had burned out of him years ago. Gerald, I'm not father material. I've killed men with my bare hands. I've done things that would give these boys nightmares. Maybe, but you've also protected them when their biological parents failed them. You fought for their future when everyone else was fighting for themselves. Gerald's voice grew serious. What kind of man does that make you, Joseph? As Joseph hung up the phone, he realized that the war he'd been fighting wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about protecting innocence from the consequences of adult failures. Marcus and Michael hadn't chosen their parents or their circumstances, but they deserved a future free from the sins of the past. Tomorrow, the defense would present their case. Tomorrow, Alan Reeves would take the stand and try to convince a jury that he was the victim. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. But tonight, Joseph had a decision to make about two little boys who saw him as their protector. The question was whether he was brave enough to be the father they needed, or whether his own demons would make him just another adult who failed them. Some battles, he was learning, were fought not with weapons, but with love. And those were often the hardest wars to win. Chapter 7. The Devil's Testimony. Alan Reeves took the witness stand on the third day of trial, his expensive suit unable to mask the desperation in his eyes. His attorney, Cora McGrath, had coached him extensively, but Joseph could see the telltale signs of a man cracking under pressure. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted toward the exit, the sheen of perspiration despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. Mr. Reeves, McGrath began, please tell the jury about your first meeting with Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson. Alan's voice was steady but rehearsed. The sergeant approached me claiming he wanted to establish a relationship with his stepchildren. He offered what appeared to be a legitimate business partnership, security consulting for my construction projects. Did you have any reason to suspect ulterior motives? None at all. He presented himself as a patriotic veteran seeking post-service employment. I wanted to help. Alan looked toward the jury, his expression crafted to convey wounded innocence. I had no idea I was being set up for an elaborate revenge plot. Joseph watched the performance with professional detachment. Alan was good, better than most Taliban commanders he'd interrogated. But like most criminals, Alan's greatest weakness was his inability to resist embellishment. McGrath guided her client through carefully rehearsed testimony. Alan portrayed himself as a successful businessman targeted by an unstable veteran, an innocent man manipulated by a master manipulator with military training in psychological warfare. Did Sergeant Nelson ever threaten you directly? McGrath asked. Constantly. He said he didn't forgive betrayal, that he would destroy anyone who crossed him. He spoke about his combat experience, about hunting men through mountains. Alan's voice carried manufactured fear. I was genuinely afraid for my safety and the safety of my family. U.S. Attorney Marla Schneider's cross-examination began with surgical precision. Mr. Reeves, you testified that you were manipulated into committing federal crimes. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am. And these crimes included bribing military officials for classified information? Allen hesitated. I was told the information sharing was legal. Mr. Reeves, I'm going to show you Exhibit 47. Schneider displayed a recording from the warehouse meeting. This is your voice, is it not? Quote, 20% of all contract values paid to offshore accounts. You're clearly discussing bribery here, aren't you? I was confused, frightened. You were negotiating the terms of a criminal conspiracy, weren't you? Schneider's voice carried prosecutorial steel. No one forced you to discuss offshore accounts or percentage payments. Those were your ideas, weren't they? The cross-examination continued for 3 hours, with Schneider systematically dismantling Allen's victim narrative. She presented evidence of his previous construction violations, his pattern of corner cutting, his history of using illegal immigrant labor to maximize profits. Mr. Reeves, how many families were sickened by toxic mold in housing units your company constructed? I don't have exact figures. 47 documented cases, according to base medical records. How many children were hospitalized due to electrical fires caused by substandard wiring in your buildings? Those were isolated incidents. 12 children, Mr. Reeves. 12 children hospitalized because you chose profit over safety. Schneider's voice carried genuine anger now. And you want this jury to believe you're the victim? By the time Schneider finished, Allen looked like a man who'd been run over by a freight train. His carefully constructed facade had crumbled, revealing the greedy, callous individual beneath. During the lunch recess, Craig Goldstein approached Joseph with urgent news. We have a problem. McGrath is calling character witnesses this afternoon. Military officers who will testify about your concerning behavior and vendetta mentality. Which officers? Colonel Kurt Shepard, your former commanding officer from your second tour. Captain Henry Green from the JAG office. Major Philip Mayo from personnel. Craig looked uncomfortable. Joseph, they're going to testify that you have a documented history of refusing to forgive perceived betrayals, that you once pursued disciplinary action against fellow soldiers for minor infractions. Joseph felt cold anger building. They're using my military record against me. It gets worse. They have documentation of the incident in Kandahar, when you refused to authorize medical evacuation for a wounded Afghan interpreter who'd been feeding information to the Taliban. That interpreter got 3 of my men killed. I know, but McGrath is going to argue it shows a pattern of ruthless behavior toward anyone you perceive as a betrayer. Craig hesitated. Joseph, is there anything in your record you haven't told me about? Joseph was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Afghan mountains and Taliban caves, about split-second decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. There are things I did over there that were necessary, but not nice. Things that kept my men alive, but wouldn't play well in a civilian courtroom. Anything McGrath could have discovered. Classified operations, mostly. She shouldn't have access. Joseph paused, but Kurt Shepard was there for most of it. If he's willing to testify against me, he might share details that paint me in an unfavorable light. That afternoon, Colonel Shepard took the stand with obvious reluctance. He was a good soldier caught in an impossible position, testifying against a decorated subordinate in a civilian court. Colonel Shepard, McGrath began, you served with Master Sergeant Nelson in Afghanistan. How would you characterize his attitude toward perceived betrayals? Shepard looked directly at Joseph before answering. The sergeant was uncompromising when it came to loyalty issues. He believed in absolute accountability. Can you give the jury a specific example? There was an incident involving an Afghan interpreter. The man had been providing information to enemy forces, which resulted in casualties among our personnel. When the interpreter was wounded in an attack, Sergeant Nelson refused to authorize medical evacuation. The courtroom stirred. McGrath pressed her advantage. A wounded man was denied medical care, based solely on Sergeant Nelson's judgment. The interpreter had betrayed his oath and gotten American soldiers killed. Sergeant Nelson felt medical resources should be reserved for loyal personnel. Shepard's voice carried reluctant admiration despite his testimony. The decision may have been harsh, but it was tactically sound. Colonel, in your opinion, is Master Sergeant Nelson capable of elaborate revenge plots against those he perceives as betrayers? Shepard met Joseph's eyes again. Sergeant Nelson is the most tactically brilliant soldier I've ever commanded. If he wanted to destroy someone, he would have the skills and knowledge to do so effectively. McGrath smiled, thinking she'd scored a victory. But Schneider's cross-examination revealed the deeper truth. Colonel Shepard, how many times did Master Sergeant Nelson risk his own life to save fellow soldiers? Countless times. He has 3 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars for heroism under fire. How many men did he bring home alive who wouldn't have survived without his intervention? Dozens. Possibly hundreds if you count the Taliban fighters who surrendered rather than face him in combat. In your opinion, Colonel, is Master Sergeant Nelson a man who protects innocents or targets them? Shepard's answer was immediate and unwavering. Sergeant Nelson has spent his entire career protecting innocents, ma'am. Whatever he did in this situation, I guarantee it was motivated by protecting someone who needed protection. The afternoon continued with other character witnesses, but the damage McGrath hoped to inflict had been largely neutralized. Joseph's military record, rather than painting him as a vengeful sociopath, revealed a man who'd spent his life making hard decisions to protect others. As court recessed for the day, Joseph received a text message that changed everything. It was from Lou Jarvis, the twins' foster father. Marcus asked me to send this. Says it's important. Attached was a child's drawing. Stick figures representing Joseph, Marcus, and Michael standing together. At the bottom, in crayon, Marcus had written, "My real dad, Joseph." Joseph stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. These boys saw him not as a weapon or a soldier, but as a protector, someone who kept them safe when their world fell apart. Craig Goldstein noticed his expression. "Everything okay?" Joseph folded the drawing carefully, placing it in his uniform pocket next to his heart. "Just remembering what I'm fighting for." Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury deliberations, and verdicts. Tomorrow would determine whether justice prevailed or whether good men were destroyed by the machinations of those they tried to protect. But tonight, Joseph had a phone call to make. To social services, to discuss adoption procedures and home studies, and all the bureaucratic necessities of becoming the father 2 little boys believed him to be. The war was almost over. It was time to start thinking about peace. Chapter 8. Verdicts and Vengeance. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Joseph spent the time visiting Marcus and Michael at their foster home, watching them play in a backyard while Lou and Carlos Jarvis discussed adoption procedures with social workers. The boys had adapted well to their new environment, but they still asked when Joseph was coming home to stay. Soon, he told them, meaning it for the first time. Very soon, on Friday morning, the jury returned with their verdict. Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed beyond capacity as Alan Reeves stood to hear his fate. The foreman, a retired military veteran named Randy Simons, read the verdict with military precision. On the charge of conspiracy to commit federal fraud, guilty. On the charge of bribery of military officials, guilty. On the charge of wire fraud, guilty. The list continued for 17 separate counts. Alan Reeves had been convicted on every charge. As the verdict was read, his face went ashen, his expensive lawyer's confident facade crumbling. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but denied bail pending appeal. "Mr. Reeves, you have systematically defrauded the United States military and endangered the lives of service members and their families. You will remain in federal custody until sentencing." As federal marshals led Alan away in shackles, he looked back at Joseph with pure hatred. "This isn't over, Nelson. I have friends, connections. You'll pay for this." Joseph met his stare without flinching. "Mr. Reeves, you just threatened a federal witness in open court. I don't think you understand how much deeper you just made your hole." Outside the courthouse, Reporters swarmed Joseph, but he issued only a brief statement. Justice has been served. Military families can sleep safely knowing that those who prey on our service members will be held accountable. That evening, Craig Goldstein called with Shelby's plea agreement. Guilty to federal fraud charges, 2 years probation, restitution to the military families affected by Allen's housing projects. She'll avoid prison time, but her financial assets remain frozen pending civil litigation. And the twins. Full termination of parental rights. Both biological parents have relinquished all claims. The boys are free for adoption. Craig paused. Joseph, Social Services wants to fast-track your application. The home study, background investigation, psychological evaluation, they're expediting everything. Joseph looked around his sparse apartment, imagining it filled with children's toys and laughter. How fast? If you're serious about this, Marcus and Michael could be home within a month. Home. The word carried weight Joseph hadn't felt in years. Afghanistan had been a mission. The apartment was a temporary quarters. But home. Home was something worth fighting for. 2 weeks later, Joseph stood in Alan Reeves' former office building, now under federal seizure and scheduled for auction. Gerald Garrison had arranged the private viewing as part of the asset forfeiture proceedings. The government will sell everything, Gerald explained as they walked through the empty corridors. Building, equipment, vehicles, even Alan's personal collection of military memorabilia. Joseph paused before a display case containing medals and awards Alan had never earned, uniforms he'd never worn, photos with military officers who trusted him. Stolen valor? Among other things. FBI found an entire room of fake military credentials, forged discharge papers, fraudulent awards. Gerald shook his head. This man wasn't just a criminal. He was a pathological liar who built his entire identity on deception. In Alan's private office, Joseph found something that made his blood run cold. A wall safe, its contents now spread across federal evidence tables, had contained detailed surveillance files on military families. Personal information, financial records, photographs of children playing in base housing that Alan's company had built. He was targeting military families specifically, Joseph realized, not just for fraud, but for potential blackmail, manipulation, identity theft. Gerald nodded grimly. The scope of his operation was far beyond what we initially discovered. Alan Reeves wasn't just stealing from the military. He was preying on military families like a predator. Joseph felt his hands clench into fists. Even in prison, Alan represented a continuing threat to innocent families. The legal system had delivered justice, but Joseph knew that justice and protection weren't always the same thing. That afternoon brought unexpected news. Alan Reeves had been found dead in his federal holding cell, an apparent suicide. Prison officials reported that he'd used bedsheets to hang himself, leaving behind a note confessing to crimes that went far beyond the charges he'd faced. Joseph received the news from Craig Goldstein with mixed emotions. Seems he couldn't face the prospect of 20 years in federal prison, Craig said. His lawyer says Alan had been receiving death threats from other inmates, military veterans who didn't appreciate his crimes against service families. Any evidence of foul play? None that I've heard about. Federal Bureau of Prisons is conducting a full investigation, but preliminary findings suggest suicide. Craig paused. Joseph, I have to ask, where were you yesterday evening? Home study appointment with Social Services. Lou and Carlos Jarvis were present, along with the caseworker and child psychologist. Joseph's alibi was airtight, which was exactly how he'd planned it. Why? Just covering all bases. With Alan dead, the defense will try to appeal his conviction, claim he was driven to suicide by prosecutorial overreach. Joseph felt satisfaction rather than sympathy. Alan Reeves had gotten off easy. Death was preferable to decades in federal prison, surrounded by the very veterans he'd betrayed. But his death also meant permanent security for the families he might have continued to threaten. That evening, Joseph received a final text message from Shelby. Alan is dead. The boys ask about you every day. Maybe we could work something out, joint custody, visitation rights. I'm still their mother. Joseph's response was immediate and final. You terminated your parental rights voluntarily. The boys have new parents now, people who put their welfare first. Don't contact this number again. Her reply came quickly. You can't keep me from my children forever. Joseph smiled grimly as he typed his response. Watch me. Then he blocked her number and deleted her contact information. Shelby Nelson was now officially part of his past, a closed chapter in a story that was finally moving toward a happy ending. 2 hours later, his doorbell rang. Joseph opened it to find Marcus and Michael standing in the hallway with Lou Jarvis, each boy carrying a small suitcase and wearing expressions of nervous excitement. Surprised, Marcus shouted, "We get to come home." Michael hung back shyly until Joseph knelt to his level. "Hey, buddy, ready to live with me? Are you going to be our real dad now?" Michael asked seriously. "If you want me to be, forever and ever." Joseph felt something he'd thought was dead stir in his chest. Hope, love, the possibility of redemption through protecting innocence rather than destroying enemies. "Forever and ever," he promised. As the boys explored their new home, Joseph had spent 2 weeks childproofing and furnishing it. Lou Jarvis pulled him aside. "They're good kids, Joseph. Resilient, smart kind. They've been through hell, but they've come out stronger." Lou smiled. "They're lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Joseph replied, watching Marcus and Michael claim their bedrooms with the excitement of children finally coming home. That night, after bedtime stories and careful navigation of new routines, Joseph sat on his couch looking at family photos he'd never thought he'd have. Marcus and Michael asleep in their beds, safe and secure for the first time in their young lives. His phone buzzed with a message from Gerald Garrison. "Heard the good news about the boys." "You did it, Joseph. You protected them." Joseph typed back, "We all did. Thank you for everything." What's next for Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson? Joseph looked toward the bedrooms where his sons slept peacefully, no longer worried about adult wars or betrayals or the complexities of a world that had tried to use them as weapons. "Teaching 2 boys how to be good men," he typed. "Seems like the most important mission I've ever had." Outside, the city hummed with the endless activity of people living their lives, chasing their dreams, making their mistakes. Some would betray those who trusted them. Some would prey on the innocent. Some would choose profit over honor. And when they did, Joseph Nelson would be there, not as a soldier seeking vengeance, but as a father protecting the future his sons would inherit. The war was over. The peace was just beginning. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months later, Joseph stood in the kitchen of his renovated house, packing lunches for Marcus and Michael's first day at their new elementary school. The sparse apartment had been replaced with a real home, bright walls covered with children's artwork, a backyard with a swing set, and bedrooms filled with toys and books and all the detritus of normal childhood. "Dad, I can't find my backpack," Marcus called from upstairs, the word "Dad" still bringing a smile to Joseph's face every time he heard it. "Check your closet, buddy, where you left it last night." Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in his school uniform and ready for the day. The shy, withdrawn child from the foster home had blossomed into a confident 7-year-old who spoke fluent Spanish and helped his father with household repairs. "Are you nervous about school?" Joseph asked, kneeling to adjust Michael's collar. "A little. But Marcus says we stick together like you taught us." "That's right. Nelson men protect each other." The adoption had been finalized 3 months earlier in a courthouse ceremony that felt nothing like the legal battles that preceded it. Judge Morrison had presided, and when he'd asked the boys if they wanted Joseph to be their legal father, Marcus had stood up in the witness chair and announced, "He already is our real dad. This just makes it official." Now Joseph was learning the complexities of single parenthood, parent-teacher conferences, soccer practice, bedtime negotiations with children who'd inherited their biological father's stubborn streak and their adoptive father's tactical intelligence. "Found it." Marcus thundered down the stairs with his backpack, nearly colliding with Johanna Woods from Social Services, who was making her final home visit. "Sorry, Miss Woods," Marcus said politely, his manners improving under Joseph's consistent guidance. "No harm done, sweetheart." Johanna watched the morning routine with professional satisfaction. "How are you feeling about school?" "Excited. Dad says education is the most powerful weapon we can carry. Joseph winced slightly at hearing his military philosophy repurposed for child-rearing, but Johanna just laughed. Your father is a wise man. After the boys left for school, accompanied by Joseph, who'd taken the morning off to ease their transition, Johanna completed her paperwork at the kitchen table. This is my last required visit, she said, but you should know that Marcus and Michael are lucky boys. You've given them stability, security, and love. They've transformed from traumatized children into confident, happy kids. They did the hard work. I just provided a safe place to heal. Don't minimize your role, Joseph. Not every wounded soldier becomes a nurturing father. You chose to channel your protective instincts into building rather than destroying. After Johanna left, Joseph sat in his empty house, enjoying the rare moment of silence. His phone buzzed with a text from Gerald Garrison. Saw the news about Shelby. Thought you should know. Joseph opened the attached news article. Shelby had been arrested in Nevada for identity theft and welfare fraud, using false names to claim benefits she wasn't entitled to. Her pattern of deception had continued even after losing her children and facing federal probation. Joseph felt no satisfaction from her continued downfall. Shelby had become irrelevant to his life the moment he'd chosen his son's welfare over his desire for revenge. She was someone else's problem now, and her children were safe from her manipulations. His laptop chimed with an incoming video call. Colonel Gerald Garrison's face appeared on screen, his expression carrying the same mixture of pride and concern that had characterized their relationship since Afghanistan. How are you adjusting to civilian life, Sergeant? Learning every day, sir. Turns out raising children requires different skills than hunting Taliban, but there's surprising overlap in the patience department. Gerald laughed. Any regrets about leaving military service? Joseph considered the question seriously. He'd taken early retirement to focus on the boys, giving up a military career that had defined him for 15 years. None, sir. This is where I'm needed most. The boys are lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one. They saved me as much as I saved them. They discussed mutual friends, former unit members, and the ongoing efforts to improve military family housing standards, a cause that had gained significant momentum following Alan Reeves' conviction and exposure of systemic problems. After the call ended, Joseph walked through his house, noting the changes 6 months of family life had wrought. Children's laughter echoed from the walls. Photos of school events and family outings replaced his military memorabilia. The rigid order of military quarters had given way to the controlled chaos of a home where children were encouraged to be children. At 3 p.m., Joseph was waiting outside the elementary school with other parents, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. When Marcus and Michael burst through the doors, their faces bright with excitement, Joseph felt the familiar surge of fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision since their first meeting. Dad, guess what happened? Marcus reached him first, practically vibrating with energy. Tell me everything. My teacher asked if anyone had family in the military, and I said my dad was a war hero, and she asked me to tell the class about it. And I said you protected people and kept them safe, and everyone thought that was really cool. Michael, always more reserved, simply hugged Joseph's leg and said quietly, I missed you today. I missed you too, buddy. Both of you. As they walked home, the boys chattering about their teachers and classmates and the 100 small dramas of elementary school life, Joseph reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. He'd begun seeking justice and revenge, motivated by betrayal and wounded pride. But somewhere along the way, the mission had changed from destroying his enemies to protecting innocents. Alan Reeves was dead. Shelby was facing the consequences of her choices. Ricardo Santos had been deported and disappeared into whatever life awaited him in Mexico. The adults who had failed these children were gone, their damage contained and neutralized. But Marcus and Michael remained. No longer weapons in other people's wars, but children with futures bright with possibility. They would grow up knowing they were loved, protected, and valued for themselves rather than what they could provide to others. That evening, after homework and dinner and the endless negotiations of bedtime, Joseph tucked his sons into their beds and read them stories about heroes and adventures and the triumph of good over evil. Simple stories with clear morals. Nothing like the complex realities of adult warfare. "Dad," Marcus said as Joseph was turning off the light, "are you going to stay with us forever?" "Forever and always, son. Nothing will ever change that. Even if we're bad sometimes." Joseph smiled, remembering his own father's unconditional love and the security it had provided through his troubled teenage years. Even then, that's what real fathers do. They love their children no matter what. "Michael was worried you might leave like our first dad did." Joseph looked at Michael, who was pretending to sleep but listening to every word. "Michael, can you hear me?" The boy's eyes opened. "Yes, sir. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, you're my sons, and we're a family. Families don't abandon each other. Promise?" "I promise." Nelson men keep their word. After the boys fell asleep, Joseph sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching stars appear in the darkening sky. His phone contained dozens of messages from old military buddies, reporters seeking follow-up interviews, and veterans advocates asking him to speak at conferences about military family issues. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, he was simply a father whose children slept safely in their beds, protected from the complexities of a world that had tried to use them as pawns in adult games. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: parent-teacher conferences, soccer games, scraped knees, and hurt feelings, and all the ordinary crises of raising children. There would be no enemy combatants to track, no classified missions to complete, no life-or-death decisions made in split seconds. Instead, there would be homework help and bedtime stories, Christmas mornings and birthday parties, graduations and first dates, and all the milestone moments that defined a childhood well-lived. Joseph Nelson had spent 15 years protecting strangers in foreign lands. Now he would spend the rest of his life protecting the two people who mattered most: his sons, who had chosen him as their father and trusted him with their futures. The war was over. The peace was everything he'd fought for, and more than he'd ever dared hope to deserve. In the distance, a siren wailed as emergency responders rushed to help someone in crisis. Other people's emergencies, other people's wars. Joseph said a brief prayer for their safety and went inside to check on his sleeping children one more time before bed. Marcus and Michael slept peacefully, their faces relaxed and untroubled, their dreams filled with the security that came from knowing they were loved and protected. Joseph stood in their doorway for a long moment, memorizing the scene, his greatest victory, his most important mission accomplished. Tomorrow, the real work would continue. Not the work of a soldier, but the work of a father. And for the first time in his adult life, Master Sergeant Joseph Nelson was exactly where he belonged. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.